topic 2 is custom exceptions. Now we've been doing exceptions, I don't know, since about week 4 or 5. You've got your value error exception, your type error exceptions, those kind of built-in exceptions. But there are times when you may want to create your own custom exceptions because you have a very specific scenario where you don't want to use one of the built-in ones, or one of the built-in ones isn't appropriate, so you have your own setup. So first off, when you're creating an exception class or a custom exception class, you need to inherit the built-in exception class. That inheritance should sound familiar now that last week we did inheritance. It's a class thing. So again, you build classes. If your class is inheriting a superclass, it needs to explicitly state that. So here's a very simple example of a custom exception class. It's just a class with pass as the body. I strongly suggest you have some kind of commenting in these classes because otherwise, if somebody goes to look at your code, they don't really know why this exception exists. But you can see I've got a class number 2 low, and I'm inheriting exception like I stated. So I always have to inherit exception. And then I've got class number 2 high and also inheriting exception. And there's no body to these two classes. They're just empty. But when I utilize them, so when using these simple classes, you can just pass the error message when raising the exception. So you can see I'm going to ask the user for a number. Hey, give me a number between 1 and 10. If the number I'm given is less than 1, I'm going to raise my custom exception. So I'm raising number 2 low. If it's greater than 10, I'm going to raise number 2 high. And in this case, I am explicitly stating the text that I want to output along with the exception that will get raised. So if I run this, if I give it 3, everything's fine. But if I run it again and give it, negative 112, you can see that I get that ugly text that you see with exceptions, and you can see name number 2 low is not defined. That's not correct because I didn't run this cell. Try that again. Negative 12. And you can see that now my custom exception happened because I actually ran my code. You can see that it is a exception of type number 2 low, and you can see the text output. That number is lower than asked for because that's what I told it to say when the exception was raised. Okay, very simple case. If I do this again and I say 100, I'm going to get a number 2 high custom exception. You can also have a default messages for your custom exceptions. I do suggest this. In most cases, it's better than just having those empty exception classes because typically when you're creating a custom exception, the error is going to be fairly reusable. You're not going to have 100 different reasons that that same error is raised. So same thing we did before with the number 2 low exception and the number 2 high exception, except this time I am going to set up a simple init, and you can see that I've got message equals none because I can override this exception when I run my code. But if there is no message, then I need to say if message equals none. So if the user did not give an overriding message when they ran their code, this is the message that will come out. It'll say this number is far too low for my tastes. And then you have to include this super number 2 low.self init message. So this is kind of that boilerplate code that you need to have. And then I can do the same thing with number 2 high. I can say, what kind of crazy high number are you sending me? So I'm going to do this. I'm going to run it. And then I'm going to say, here, give me a number. Again, if I give it 3, everything's fine. But if I give it negative 12, you can see the number 2 low exception was raised. And it says this is a small number. And that's because when I did the raise, I overrode the default message that is included with the class. However, you can see with number 2 high, I don't override it. So if I run this, I make it 22. Now you can see that it takes that default message from my custom exception class and utilizes it. So that's kind of the, I would suggest you have a standard exception message and then allow users to override it if they need to. Okay, so that's custom exceptions. That's kind of all we get into with custom exceptions. We don't get to have too much depth in them. A lot of times you can use the built-in exceptions for most reasonable cases, but it's good to know that you can go off and do your own thing if you need to.